Hey guys, tonight we will enter a dark corner of history, where the luxury of Versailles vanished into the cold silence of a prison. We will listen to the story of Marie Antoinette. She was once the embodiment of the rising sun in France, but ultimately set as a scapegoat. She was confined under a pathetic name, Widow Capet, merely a burden of the past, assigned prisoner number 280 in a lengthy roster. This cruel transformation from queen to an anonymous number is the genesis of the tragedy. The reason she was brought to her death was not just the fabricated charge of treason. It was the release of an entire nation's fury against inherited privileges and the suspicion of her loyalty to France. She was condemned to death by the guillotine on a fateful midday in October 1793. But what truly broke her? Was it the humiliation of crude guards denying her a single second of privacy? Or was it the venomous accusation of incest, used as a psychological weapon to kill her spirit before ending her life? After the blade silently descended, her name was erased from all contemporary chronicles. The body of the former queen was discarded in an unmarked lime pit without a single prayer or royal ceremony. Tonight, we will tell the story of those final hours, gently like a passing breeze, to understand that even the most powerful people cannot escape the storm of destiny. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Before we begin, I'm curious to know where you are listening to this story from. Please comment below and let me know your city and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. At dawn on the 10th of August in the year 1792, the royal family of France stirred from uneasy slumber within the gilded halls of the Tuileries Palace. A chorus of warning bells, each toll echoing across the silent streets of Paris, ripped at the fragile peace of dawn. Through high windows, Marie Antoinette could just make out the flicker of torches carried by advancing figures. Men of the National Guard, fédérés in their blue and red uniforms, and armed citizens whose faces, until recently, had shown nothing but deference to the crown. Among them, some had once knelt before Louis XVI in genuine loyalty. Now, they gathered with pikes and muskets to storm the palace gates. For Marie Antoinette, this morning marked the final unraveling of a life once bathed in opulence and splendor. Only 3 years before, she had worn the crown of France with proud elegance, her gowns of silk and lace, her jewels glinting beneath the palace lights, and the bowed heads of courtiers had seemed eternal. Yet here she stood, behind hastily erected barricades of wooden beams and overturned chairs, gazing through a narrow slit in the palace wall, as the very subjects she had once guided silently vowed her downfall. The Tuileries, once the grand centerpiece of royal authority, had become a golden cage, the walls of which she could neither scale nor escape. That gilded prison had been fashioned in the aftermath of the failed flight to Varennes in the month of June 1791. In that ill-fated effort, Louis XVI and his family sought to flee Paris under cover of darkness, hoping to rally loyalist forces in the provinces. The plan collapsed within 24 hours, leaving the king's reputation in shreds and the fragile trust between crown and citizen irreparably broken. From that moment forward, the Queen's Austrian birth and foreign connections only fueled suspicions that she conspired against the nation she was meant to serve. Pamphlets and caricatures circulated through Parisian streets, lampooning her as Madame Déficit, the spendthrift queen whose taste for silks and extravagance betrayed the suffering of the hungry masses. As the mob gathered beyond the palace walls on that fateful morning, the Swiss Guards mercenary troops, famed for their unwavering loyalty, stood firm at their posts. Their red uniforms were bright even in the dim light, their halberds raised in silent defiance. Yet King Louis XVI, crippled by indecision and haunted by memories of past failures, refused to grant permission for his soldiers to fire upon his own people. In the face of that hesitation, he led his family quietly through the palace gardens, their footsteps echoing on dew-soaked gravel, toward the Legislative Assembly's chambers. There, he sought the protection of the very body that had once jeered his name. Within hours, the Tuileries fell. Hundreds perished in the ensuing clash. Some historians estimate the death toll at more than 200, among them dozens of the Swiss Guards who died defending the palace. The monarchy was suspended that very day, its institutions dismantled with cold efficiency. The royal family was placed under armed escort and led to the temple, a medieval fortress repurposed as a prison in the heart of Paris. From queen to captive, Marie Antoinette's transformation was complete. Gone forever were the titles of majesty and reverence. In the language of the revolutionaries, she was no longer Her Majesty, but merely the widow Capet, a name chosen to strip her of all vestiges of royal dignity, even though Louis XVI still drew breath beside her. The notion of a queen, sleeping in lavish chambers, attended by servants at a moment's notice, seemed as distant as a dream. Each passing hour promised harsher constraints, colder walls, and the sorrowful weight of chains. And so, as the sun climbed higher on that summer morning, Marie Antoinette, her heart heavy with the loss of crown and comfort, gazed down the palace corridors that she would never traverse again. The clank of distant weapons, the murmur of revolutionaries beyond the gates, and the final tolling of those dreadful bells all combined into a dirge for a world slipping into history. In that moment of quiet despair, the Queen knew that the age of gilded privilege had ended, and that the long night of imprisonment had only just begun. On the night of August 2nd, 1793, long after the city of Paris had fallen silent beneath a moonless sky, municipal officials of the Paris Commune arrived at the medieval fortress known as the Temple. Their footsteps echoed on the damp stone floors as they informed Marie Antoinette, in hushed, stern tones, that she would be transferred at first light to the Conciergerie on Ile de la Cité. The Conciergerie, whispered among prisoners as the antechamber of the guillotine, awaited her arrival. Separated here, in the chill air and flickering torchlight, Marie Antoinette felt the final barrier descend between herself and all she had once held dear. Each surviving member of her family, once encircled by her love and counsel, was now scattered like autumn leaves in a cruel wind. Her daughter, Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, known simply as Madame Royale, would later recall in her memoirs that their final embrace was wordless, a silent communion of sorrow, for every whisper risked interception by watchful ears. Within hours, the Queen was led across a narrow stone bridge to the Conciergerie's imposing gates. The next morning, August 3rd, her name, once uttered with reverence in royal courts, appeared in the prison registry as Widow Capet, a cruelly ironic appellation since her husband yet lived. This deliberate renaming stripped her of any remaining pretense of royal status. No longer Marie Antoinette, Dauphine of France, no longer Her Majesty the Queen, merely a widow of the ancient Capetian line. Her cell lay in the women's wing, directly above the dark waters of the Seine. Measuring roughly 3 meters by 2 meters, it was enclosed by rough-hewn stone walls and iron bars that glinted coldly in torchlight. The only source of natural light was a narrow slit window, no wider than a man's fist, positioned high above her head. When the great swell of the river rose in winter, the cell floor sometimes moistened, and the stench of damp earth seeped in. A contemporary prison reformer, Jacques-Pierre Brissot, later described the women's cells of the Conciergerie as perpetually damp, icy to the bone, and infested with lice and rats. For the first nights, Marie Antoinette had no bed. She lay upon a crude heap of straw, thin and compressed, offering scant comfort to a body unaccustomed to such hardship. On the 5th of August, 1793, a municipal decree ordered that she be placed under continuous surveillance without interruption. 2 gendarmes were assigned to her cell, their watchful eyes never leaving their charge, even as she attempted the simple acts of undressing or washing, depriving her of any semblance of privacy. In the weeks that followed, a prison doctor summoned under orders of the Revolutionary Committee made repeated visits to her cell. His notes, preserved in the Archives Nationales, record a decline in her health that was both swift and severe. She suffered from uterine hemorrhaging, a condition that left her in constant pain and extreme weakness. Her weight plummeted at an alarming rate. Observers noted that by late September, she appeared gaunt and fragile, her cheeks hollow beneath skin drawn taut. Perhaps the most striking change was in her hair. Once powdered in the style of Versailles court fashion, it turned stark white, an effect that some witnesses described as almost luminous in the dim prison light. By the 28th of September, her locks were so pale that they betrayed the passage of her youthful vitality. Each thread of hair seemed to carry the burden of loss and confinement. In a final act of quiet defiance, Marie Antoinette attempted to smuggle a letter to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, who herself remained imprisoned elsewhere in Paris. The note, written in a trembling hand, contained but a single, poignant sentence: "I have nothing left to hope for in this world." Yet the letter was intercepted by her guards and delivered instead to the Revolutionary Tribunal, where it now lies preserved among the archives as evidence of her despair. That line so bare and absolute serves as a testament to the once grand queen brought low by history's inexorable currents. It was a confession made not to the court or to her captors, but to family bound by blood and shared suffering. In that cramped cell, the wordless stillness that followed its composition was itself a form of resistance, a refusal to speak further until her fate was sealed. As the nights lengthened and the torches guttered low against the cell walls, Marie Antoinette lay upon her straw pallet, feeling the chill press through her gowns. The tremor of distant footsteps, the murmur of guards changing watch, and the ever-present echo of dripping water were her only companions in the dark. Sleep, when it came, was fitful, haunted by memories of Versailles, of gilded salons and laughter now lost. Each breath carried the weight of exile from a world she had once ruled. Thus, in the house that had once known royalty's laughter, the woman who had worn crowns found herself clothed only in resignation and silence, her hopes distilled into a single, sorrowful line. The conciergeries' stone walls bore witness to her final transformation, from queen to prisoner, from majesty to widow Capet, and from a life of unbounded promise to a destiny confined within iron bars, and the interminable passage of cold nights. The trial of Marie Antoinette commenced on the morning of the 14th of October, in the year 1793, within the vaulted hall of the conciergerie. The sun had scarcely risen when she was escorted into a chamber flanked by armed sentinels, the very air heavy with the solemnity of impending judgment. Official transcripts, later published in the Bulletin du Tribunal Révolutionnaire, detail the charges brought against her: treason against the nation of France, collusion with foreign powers, the orchestration of counter-revolutionary plots, and most shockingly the accusation of incest with her own son, the Dauphin Louis Charles. That final charge, based upon testimony extracted from the child under duress, was denounced by some moderate revolutionaries as a cynical ploy to sully her reputation. Presiding over the proceedings was Antoine Quentin Fouquier-Tinville, the public prosecutor of the Revolutionary Tribunal, infamous for the swiftness with which he secured convictions. His reputation for urgency and severity had been cemented during the Reign of Terror, and this morning was no exception. The courtroom was arrayed like a stage, muskets glinting in the dim light, pikes serving as barricades, and selected spectators, men loyal to the Jacobin cause, packed into the galleries. The atmosphere, as reported by the British diplomat Francis Jackson, felt less like a quest for truth and more like a spectacle meant to demonstrate the power of revolutionary justice. Marie Antoinette appeared before the tribunal in a simple black dress and a plain white bonnet, her once glossy hair now stark and unpowdered. Her eyes, set deeply in her pale cheeks, betrayed exhaustion, yet remained unbowed. Throughout the early interrogations, she was questioned vigorously about her correspondence with foreign courts. When asked whether she had exchanged letters or secret directives with the Emperor of Austria or the King of Prussia, she categorically denied any military plots or clandestine agreements. Her tone was measured, her posture dignified. Then came the moment that froze the courtroom, the prosecutor's reading of the incest accusation. Rising to her full height as though calling upon every shred of maternal instinct, Marie Antoinette's voice rang clear, yet somnolent in its cadence. "I appeal to all mothers." The hush that fell over the chamber was profound, an acknowledgement, however brief, of her humanity. Even some of her staunchest critics reportedly recoiled at the impropriety of such a charge. Central to the prosecution's case was the so-called armoire de fer, the secret iron cabinet uncovered in the Tuileries Palace the previous year. Inside it lay documents and letters, some bearing names of foreign ministers and military officers. Yet upon close examination, many of these papers proved ambiguous or unrelated to the Queen's direct actions. Some described routine diplomatic exchanges, others referenced loans extended to the Crown before the Revolution. No explicit orders for invasion or sabotage were found, and no correspondence bore her personal signature in unequivocal terms. Over the course of 2 days, the tribunal heard these arguments without permitting Marie Antoinette a full opportunity to call witnesses on her behalf or to introduce exculpatory evidence. Defense counsel were limited to brief statements that Fouquier-Tinville frequently interrupted. The bench, composed of revolutionaries chosen for their loyalty to the Jacobin cause, listened with impassive expressions. The ritual of justice had been replaced by the machinery of political retribution. By the evening of the 15th, the prosecution rested. There had been no thorough cross-examination of key witnesses, no medical expert to address the reliability of testimony obtained from the Dauphin, and no presentation of mitigating circumstances. The silence of the royal family, dispersed and forbidden from testifying, echoed ominously in the chamber's stone corridors. The jury, 10 men and 5 women hand-picked by municipal authorities, retired briefly. When they returned, the foreman announced their unanimous verdict: death by guillotine. There was no murmur, no gasp. Marie Antoinette, stoic as ever, exhibited no visible emotion. Her face, like alabaster in candlelight, conveyed resignation rather than shock. At once, the sentence was read aloud. The defendant, Marie Antoinette, formerly Queen of France, is hereby condemned to death. Her last glance swept the courtroom, meeting the eyes of guards and onlookers alike, before she bowed her head and was led away. Outside the chamber, the guillotine's blade awaited her, its shadow, a silent testament to a justice that had chosen spectacle over fairness. And so concluded the final act of a trial that had transformed a living queen into a symbol of revolutionary vengeance. In those hushed, oppressive hours, the line between law and theatre blurred, leaving behind the memory of a tribunal less intent on ascertaining truth than on delivering the ultimate irrevocable judgment. The sentence was proclaimed at 4 o'clock in the early morning of the 16th of October, 1793. Marie Antoinette had but a few scant hours to prepare for her final departure. At 7 o'clock, as the first pale light of dawn crept through the narrow slit of her conciergerie cell, she was gently roused from a restless sleep. According to the later testimony of Marie Groschholz, who would become known to posterity as Madame Tussaud, the former queen was afforded only a simple white chemise, the plain linen garment reserved for condemned prisoners. Her hands were bound behind her back with cold iron cuffs, a harsh counterpoint to the silk gowns and jewelled bracelets she had once worn. Unlike her husband, Louis XVI, who had been granted the courtesy of a closed carriage on the morning of his execution, Marie Antoinette was placed upon an open wooden cart. This was the same vehicle ordinarily used to transport the lowest of criminals through the city's streets. The cart's unadorned sides bore the marks of countless journeys under escort, its axle creaking ominously with each movement. There was no canopy to shield her from the chill autumn air, no guards in powdered wigs to lend an air of solemn ceremony, only the stark reality of her impending fate. The procession set forth from the conciergerie under the watchful guard of gendarmes and National Guardsmen. Mounted cavalry flanked the cart on both sides, their horses' hooves clipping softly against the cobblestones of Ile de la Cité before turning eastward onto the Quai de l'Horloge. As the cart rolled onto Rue Saint-Honoré, thousands of Parisians had already gathered, lining the narrow sidewalks from the Palais de Justice to the Place de la Révolution. Torchlight flickered against damp stone walls, and the murmurs of the crowd rose in anxious anticipation. Many recalled her once extravagant court at Versailles, now reduced to dust and distant memory. Jacques Roux, a fervent Jacobin who observed the tableau, noted that Marie Antoinette sat erect upon the cart, her head held high even as a grey dawn settled over the city. Her hair, once powdered in the high fashion of court ladies, had been clipped short in preparation for the guillotine, now a stark, snowy halo about her head. Witnesses later recorded that each lock of hair, trimmed mere hours before, fluttered gently in the autumn breeze, as though bidding farewell to a life of privilege. The journey from prison to scaffold lasted over 1 hour, a slow, sombre passage that transformed city streets into a river of witness and judgment. 30 gendarmes and 60 National Guardsmen comprised the escort, their presence a rigid frame around the fragile figure of the Queen. Spectators, some jeering, some silent, formed a dense barrier of humanity, their faces illuminated by torchlight and early morning greyness. Here and there, a child peered from a window ledge. There, an old woman's eyes brimmed with tears as the procession passed. At precisely 12:15 p.m., the cart reached its destination on the Place de la Révolution. The guillotine, assembled earlier that morning, stood stark against the pale sky, its framework as bare and inevitable as fate itself. Executioner Henri Sanson, a tall man whose reputation for efficiency was as well known as his brutal instrument, stepped forward to assist Marie Antoinette from the cart. In the final moments, he would later testify, she misstepped and accidentally trod upon his foot. With characteristic grace, she paused and murmured, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." As she ascended the wooden steps leading to the device, the assembled crowd fell silent. Even the clatter of muskets and the shuffle of boots seemed to fade into stillness. A single bird, the reports vary whether it was a crow or a mourning dove, took wing overhead, its cry echoing above the hush. Then, at 12:15 precisely, the blade fell. For a moment, an eerie silence reigned. Then, from throats both rough and refined, a chorus of shouts erupted. "Vive la République!" Yet several observers, including journalists for the Mercier Gazette, would later recall a brief, solemn pause, a collective breath held in dread respect before the cry rose. The lifeless body of Marie Antoinette was placed in a plain pine coffin, its lid secured without ceremony, and carried away to an unmarked grave at the Madeleine Cemetery, alongside many others who had perished in the terror. Thus ended the final journey of France's last queen, her passage from gilded hall to common cart, a stark emblem of a world turned upside down. In the hush that lingered upon the Place de la Révolution, the echo of her last words, apology and grace, at the foot of the scaffold, remained the truest testament to the dignity she retained, even on the brink of oblivion. In the silent grey light of October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette's body was taken from the scaffold and carried away amid the clamorous shouts of "Vive la République!" Yet the cheering crowd faded into an uneasy hush as her remains were deposited in an unmarked pit at the Cimetière de la Madeleine. Hundreds of others, nobles, clergy, and commoners condemned during the terror, lay side by side in that nameless grave, their identities lost to the anonymity of revolution. No stone marked the spot where a queen once knelt in prayer. No inscription recalled the blood-stained hands that signed the death warrant. For more than 2 decades, her bones rested in that humble earth, mingling with the discarded relics of a bygone era. The revolution gave no quarter to symbols of ancient regime, and the memory of the woman who once reigned in gilded splendor was buried along with her corporeal remains. On cold November nights, when winds swept down the Rue Royale, one could almost imagine a distant echo of silken skirts brushing palace floors, an echo that time itself struggled to preserve or extinguish. It was not until the spring of 1815, 2 full decades after her execution, that the political tides turned once more. With the fall of Napoleon and the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy under King Louis XVI II, a new decree authorized the retrieval of royal remains scattered or buried in unmarked graves. On the 30th of March, 1815, under overcast skies, workers exhumed the pit at Madeleine. Among the fragments of bone and tattered garments, a small silver medallion bearing the image of Saint Genevieve, the patron saint of Paris, bore witness to one life of privilege and tragedy. The delicate task of identifying her remains fell to court physicians and a handful of surviving servants, who recalled the distinctive pattern of lace that had trimmed her chemise on the day she died. Once recognized, her bones were reverently placed in a simple lead coffin inscribed Marie Antoinette, Reine de France, and transported with solemn dignity to the Basilica of Saint-Denis. There, on April 2nd, 1815, her coffin was lowered into the royal crypt, a vaulted chamber lined with marble sarcophagi of France's kings and queens, stretching back nearly a millennium. As the casket descended, the flicker of candlelight danced upon carved reliefs of angels bearing trumpets, and a hush settled over the assembled courtiers. For them, the restoration was not merely a political act, but an affirmation of continuity. The divine right of kings, they believed, could weather even the fiercest storms of revolution. Yet for others, the reinterment of a former queen was an uneasy reminder of the fragility of privilege. Marie Antoinette's life from her birth as an Archduchess of Austria, on November 2nd, 1755, through her marriage at 14 to the future Louis XVI, to the tragic end at 37, embodied the rise and fall of an entire world. Her gilded carriages, her silk gowns, and the laughter of Versailles courts stood in stark contrast to the prison straw and iron bars of the Conciergerie, where she had spent her final days. The trial and execution exposed how swiftly revolutions could devour their own symbols. Yesterday's queen was today's traitor, and tomorrow's lesson in revolutionary zeal. In her last recorded words, "I forgive all my enemies, I die in the hope that my death will reunite my children," she offered a final testament to mercy amid vengeance. That letter, preserved in the Archives Nationales, captures the paradox of her fate. The woman who once commanded armies and courts humbled herself to forgive, seeking not vengeance but reunion beyond this world. Her reburial at Saint-Denis marked both an end and a beginning. The Bourbon Restoration attempted to revive the old order's dignity, but the age of unchecked monarchical power had irrevocably ended. France, scarred by terror and war, stood at the threshold of a new chapter in which notions of citizenship and equality would forever challenge the ancient regime. Yet Marie Antoinette's memory endured beyond politics. Poets and historians, novelists and filmmakers continued to draw upon her story as a cautionary tale of excess and downfall, of compassion and betrayal. The rediscovered lace, the lead coffin, the marble tomb they became, objects of pilgrimage, symbols that even a queen's bones could speak across centuries of human folly and resilience. Thus, in the quiet crypt beneath the vaulted ceiling of Saint-Denis, Marie Antoinette rests among kings and queens whose lives and deaths shaped France's destiny. Her unmarked grave at Madeleine and her later interment stand as bookends to a life that witnessed the end of divine right and the birth of a republic, an indelible chapter in the long, sombre narrative of power, privilege, and the inexorable march of history. The trial of Marie Antoinette opened on the morning of October 14th, 1793, in the Grand Hall of the Conciergerie, a chamber that had once served as the royal family's council room, but was now repurposed to adjudicate citizens of France. From the very first moments, the air in that vaulted hall had lost all semblance of solemn dignity. Instead, it resembled a staged political spectacle, meticulously directed by public prosecutor Antoine Quentin Fouquier-Tinville. Renowned throughout Paris for his ruthless efficiency, Fouquier-Tinville arrived with a dossier of charges pre-arranged and ready for public display. Among these charges were high treason, collusion with foreign powers, plotting counter-revolutionary uprisings, and the most sensational accusation of all that Marie Antoinette had engaged in incest with her own son, the Dauphin Louis Charles. This last allegation rested upon statements obtained under duress from a frightened child imprisoned within the same walls. No concrete evidence would be presented to substantiate any of these claims. Instead, Fouquier-Tinville brandished private letters, torn and hastily deciphered, their contents ripe for any sensational interpretation. He also paraded before the court the so-called armoire de feu, the iron cabinet discovered in the Tuileries the previous year. Its contents included diplomatic correspondence, receipts, and notes from the pre-revolutionary court. Yet none of these documents bore her personal handwriting or an explicit instruction to instigate military action. They were, at best, ambiguous scraps of courtly intrigue. Presiding over the trial was a jury handpicked for its unwavering loyalty to the Jacobin faction. Seated high above the defendant, these jurors watched with impassive faces as Fouquier-Tinville wielded his accusations like a sword. The benches below brimmed with selected observers, members of the Revolutionary Council, armed guards of the National Guard, and a smattering of zealous journalists. Not a single family member or loyalist advocate was permitted to enter. Marie Antoinette's advocates, few in number and heavily monitored, were allowed only brief remarks, and were frequently cut short by the prosecutor's rebukes. Among foreign diplomats, whispers circulated that this so-called tribunal was less concerned with uncovering truth than with demonstrating the revolution's capacity for swift, uncompromising justice. Francis Jackson, a British envoy present at the proceedings, later described the atmosphere as akin to a public entertainment rather than a court of law. Muskets and pikes flanked the high walls, serving as silent reminders that the revolution's mercy could never be taken for granted. When the questioning turned to her private correspondence with Emperor Leopold II of Austria, Marie Antoinette met each accusation with composed denial. Clad in a modest black dress and a simple white bonnet, her appearance betrayed exhaustion but radiated stoic resolve. She maintained steady eye contact with her accusers, though her cheeks were sunken and her voice carried a drowsy calm. She refuted each claim of secret pacts or military plotting, insisting that her letters contained only articles of state and pleading for peace. Then came the moment that reverberated through the chamber, the incest charge. The prosecutor's reading of lurid testimony from a child compelled to speak of his mother's alleged improprieties was met with stunned silence. Lifting her chin, Marie Antoinette addressed the court in a voice both soft and tremulous. "I appeal to all mothers." The hush that followed was profound, as if the entire assembly momentarily recognized the cruel absurdity of the accusation. Even among her fiercest critics, a grudging respect surfaced for her courage. Over the next 2 days, October 15th and 16th, the proceedings accelerated in feverish haste. Witnesses called by the prosecution were often individuals who had never met the Queen or whose memories were hazy at best. Commoners testified to overheard rumours. Former courtiers produced letters they had found in dusty palace archives. No effort was made to verify the authenticity of these claims, nor to allow the defence to challenge them. Marie Antoinette's legal team pleaded repeatedly to call character witnesses or to cross-examine the Dauphin, but Fouquier-Tinville blocked each request with procedural objections. In the small hours of October 16th, the jury retired. After less than an hour of deliberation, they returned with their verdict unanimous in its severity. The foreman announced that Marie Antoinette was to be sentenced to death by guillotine. It was 4 o'clock in the morning. As the words, "condemned to death," echoed through the vaulted chamber, Marie Antoinette lowered her gaze and stood in silence, offering neither plea nor protest. Her expression was one of quiet resignation, as though her fate had been sealed long before she ever entered that hushed hall. Thus ended the trial that reduced a queen to the status of a common criminal in the eyes of revolutionary France. In those brief, drowsy hours of October, justice had been subverted by spectacle, and politics had triumphed over fairness. The memory of that day when a throne crumbled under the weight of accusation became a somber testament to how revolutions could devour even the most revered of their own symbols. At 7 o'clock on the morning of October 16, 1793, the heavy door of Marie Antoinette's tiny cell in the conciergerie swung open, summoning her to face her final hours. The shadows of early dawn still clung to the narrow corridor as she rose from her straw pallet. According to the memoirs of Marie Groscholtz, later famed as Madame Tussaud, the former queen was permitted only a plain white chemise, the coarse garment reserved for those condemned to die. 2 gendarmes stood beside her, their expressions impassive, as they bound her wrists behind her back with cold iron manacles. There were no silken robes, no velvet draperies to ease her passage. Unlike her husband, Louis XVI, who had been granted the privacy of a covered carriage, she was ordered into an open wooden cart, the standard conveyance for ordinary criminals. Her procession began on the stone-paved courtyard of the conciergerie, where the lanterns still glowed like captive stars. The cart lurched forward at a measured pace, its wooden wheels creaking beneath the weight of the condemned queen. Flanking the cart on either side were platoons of gendarmerie in dark blue coats and gleaming brass buttons, alongside battalions of the National Guard, whose muskets formed a rigid corridor of steel. A detachment of cavalry, 20 horsemen in green tunics, paced in formation to ensure no interruption. As the cart emerged onto the Rue de la Cité, the city of Paris held its breath. Thousands of spectators lined the streets, their figures dim silhouettes beneath the overcast sky. Some looked on with jubilation, waving handkerchiefs or brandishing makeshift banners. Others, struck by her vulnerability, stared in muted sorrow. A handful turned away, unable to witness the spectacle of a woman once clad in brocaded gowns and crowned with precious stones reduced to bound ankles and bare feet. By the time the cart reached the bustling thoroughfare of Rue Saint-Honoré, the murmurs had grown into a cacophony of clamour. Men and women pressed against shop fronts and street corners, their voices rising in a mixture of triumph, pity and horror. Yet through it all, Marie Antoinette sat with her back straight, head held high, her white bonnet framing a face etched with both fatigue and resolve. Jacques Roux, the zealous agitator of the revolution, later recorded that the former queen was motionless, gazing straight ahead, as though each step drew her closer to destiny rather than demise. The journey stretched on for over an hour, the cart's pace unhurried, allowing the city ample time to witness the spectacle. As the sun climbed higher, casting a pallid light upon the cobblestones, they arrived at the Place de la Révolution. There, a wooden scaffold stood ready, its guillotine towering above in grim anticipation. A hush fell over the crowd, the noisy throng pausing as if in collective intake of breath. By custom, condemned prisoners were required to have their hair shorn before execution. The executioner's assistant produced scissors and swiftly cut the queen's now white locks, the strands falling in silence. This act, intended to strip away any remaining token of her former dignity, transformed her once glamorous coiffure into a stark reminder of her mortality. As the cart drew alongside the scaffold, Henri Sanson, the appointed executioner, stepped forward to assist. He offered his arm, and Marie Antoinette, despite her bound hands, accepted his support as she climbed the 3 steps leading to the raised platform. In the official record, Sanson later recounted a brief, poignant moment. The queen had accidentally trodden upon his foot, and in that instant she gazed down and murmured, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." These were, as far as witnesses could discern, her final words. Then, precisely at 12:15 by the clock, the blade fell. The sound was sharp against the hush that had descended upon the masses. For an instant all cheering ceased. Even those who moments before had shouted, "Vive la République!" stepped back in silence. The crowd watched as her body was lowered from the scaffold and placed into a simple wooden coffin. Without ceremony or epitaph, her remains were gathered and conveyed to the nearby Madeleine Cemetery. There, in an unmarked trench among hundreds of victims of the terror, she was interred under the grey earth. No stone to bear her name, no inscription to recall her royal lineage. Her fate remained so for more than 2 decades. It was not until the spring of 1815, 22 years later, that the Bourbon monarchy was restored under King Louis XVI II. On March 30th of that year, a royal commission ordered the exhumation of the unmarked graves at Madeleine. Among the scattered bones, court officials identified a handful belonging to the Queen by the fragments of her chemise and the silver clasp that had once fastened her bodice. On April 2nd, 1815, her remains were solemnly transported to the Basilica of Saint-Denis. In the ancient royal necropolis, where the sarcophagi of France's monarchs stretched back nearly a millennium, Marie Antoinette's bones were laid to rest in a lead-lined coffin engraved, "Marie Antoinette, Reine de France." Candlelight flickered against the stained glass windows as courtiers and clergy offered prayers for the soul of the once glorious queen. And so concluded the final chapter of her earthly journey. From gilded throne room to straw pallet, from princely carriage to open cart, from nameless grave to sacred crypt. In the hush of Saint-Denis, the echo of her life, a tapestry of privilege, turmoil, and forgiveness, lingers still, a testament to the inexorable ebb of power and the fragile legacy of those who wear a crown. The interrogation and trial of Marie Antoinette left an indelible mark on the course of the French Revolution, embodying the grim paradox whereby a movement rooted in ideals of liberty, equality, and justice could betray its own principles. Convened as a swift proceeding, the trial unfolded in mid-October of 1793, with the former queen subjected to a spectacle of accelerated judgment rather than a genuine search for truth. From the outset, the tribunal operated under a mandate to secure a predetermined outcome. Witnesses were selected almost exclusively from among the Jacobin faction, each chosen for their radical allegiance rather than objective testimony. No representatives of the royalist cause were permitted to participate, nor were any independent defense attorneys allowed to cross-examine the prosecution's assertions. Central to the Crown prosecution was the so-called armoire de feu, the iron cabinet discovered in the Tuileries Palace the previous year. Initially heralded as incontrovertible proof of the Queen's collusion with foreign powers, the documents displayed within were, in reality, a muddled collection of diplomatic correspondence and pre-revolutionary decrees. While several notes referenced financial agreements or pleas for military aid to stave off unrest, none constituted direct orders from Marie Antoinette herself. Many historians have since observed that these papers were taken out of context, their contents arbitrarily interpreted to suit the revolution's broader objectives. What might once have been routine statecraft became, through selective presentation and editorial manipulation, evidence of high treason. Even more egregious was the incest accusation levelled against the Dauphin Louis Charles, scarcely 10 years old at that time. According to trial records, his statements were obtained through secret interrogations conducted without any medical expert or legal guardian present. His testimony, utterly self-contradictory in places, was transcribed and read aloud as though it were incontrovertible fact. Revolutionary moderates, appalled by the depths to which the tribunal had sunk, publicly denounced this charge as the nadir of political defamation. Yet these protests went unheeded. The trial's momentum was sustained by the Revolutionary Tribunal Bulletin, which Fouquier, Tinville's office, published under the title Bulletin du Tribunal Révolutionnaire. This printed record, distributed widely through Parisian printing presses, commemorated the trial as a triumph of revolutionary justice, cementing its political character, even as it undermined any pretense of impartiality. Over 2 days, from the morning of October 15th to the dawn of October 16th, the trial proceeded at a breakneck pace. Interrogations overlapped, evidence was presented without documentation, and Marie Antoinette's own objections were dismissed with brusque irrelevance. She implored the court for the simplest due process to confront her accusers, to contest the armoire de feu exhibits, and to summon medical or character witnesses on behalf of her son. Each request was rebuffed, often with Fouquier Tinville's characteristic interruption, and with procedural technicalities that rendered justice impossible. By the early hours of October 16th, the jury of 15, composed entirely of individuals loyal to the Jacobin cause, retired to deliberate. Their verdict returned swiftly: unanimous condemnation to death by guillotine. When the foreman announced this sentence, Marie Antoinette lowered her head in silent acquiescence, signaling that she recognized the outcome had been sealed long before the first question was asked. In the aftermath, observers on both sides of the political divide pondered the trial's implications. To royalist sympathizers, it confirmed their worst fears, that the revolution was indiscriminate in its vengeance, indifferent even to innocence. To moderates and constitutional monarchists, it was a cautionary tale of how zealotry could corrode the very foundations of lawful governance. The armoire de feu became shorthand for revolutionary overreach, while the incest charge stood as a stark warning of how rumor and misrepresentation could be weaponized against any symbol of the old order. Scholars in subsequent generations have debated the trial's legacy. Some argue that its theatrical brutality was a necessary deterrent, intended to dissuade foreign intervention and rally the beleaguered French populace around a common enemy. Others contend that it undermined the revolution's moral authority, alienating potential allies at home and abroad. In either case, the episode underscored a fundamental truth: when the machinery of justice becomes indistinguishable from the machinery of political repression, no individual, however exalted, can claim immunity. The fate of Marie Antoinette thus became emblematic of the revolution's capacity for self-cannibalization. A monarch who had once presided over glittering balls and patronized the finest artists in Europe was transformed into a cautionary legend. Her trial demonstrated how rapidly public sentiment could be inflamed, how easily private correspondence could be misread, and how readily the mechanisms of state could be bent toward retribution rather than reason. Even today, historians reflect upon the trial as a poignant lesson in the fragility of justice. In the hallowed halls of legal institutions, her case is often cited when examining the dangers of politicized courts, the ethical breaches of forced testimony, and the perils of trampling civil liberties in the name of security. In this light, Marie Antoinette's ordeal transcends its 18th century origins, resonating across eras as a reminder that the pursuit of political ideals must never forsake the principles of fairness and human dignity. Ultimately, the trial of Marie Antoinette and its chillingly swift execution of sentence stands as a testament to the revolution's darker capacities. It exemplifies how fervent devotion to an ideology can lead to the sacrifice of the very virtues it claims to uphold. In the end, her trial proved that a revolution, unchecked by empathy and guided by vengeance, can indeed consume even the most cherished of its own creations. For contemporary European audiences, the execution of Marie Antoinette on the 16th of October in the year 1793 signified far more than the end of a dynasty. It heralded a new chapter in history, one in which the concept of divine right was irrevocably challenged, and the notion of inherited privilege repudiated. News of the Queen's beheading spread across the continent with astonishing speed, carried by dispatches, newspapers, and word of mouth. In capitals from London to Vienna, courtiers and commoners alike reacted with a mixture of shock and dread. The very idea that a deposed monarch could meet her end at the hands of her former subjects and beneath the blade of a crude mechanical device stirred anxieties about the revolution's power and its capacity for unrelenting violence. Literature, theatre, and visual arts of the period quickly seized upon Marie Antoinette's fate as a symbol of tragic sacrifice. Poets composed elegies that lamented her youth. She was only 37 at her death, and the loss of innocence represented by her final plea to her executioner. "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." Playwrights dramatized the moment the Queen ascended the scaffold in a simple white chemise, transforming her final act of apology into a universal emblem of human compassion. Painters rendered her likeness in stark chiaroscuro, her powdered hair, now turned white with fear, glowing against the dark backdrop of the guillotine's frame. These works resonated as much with the ideals of martyrdom as with the horrors of a society tearing itself apart. Within France itself, the émigré community royalist exiles who had fled the revolution embraced Marie Antoinette's image as a rallying cry for the restoration of the monarchy. Many émigrés commissioned portraits that depicted her in the finery of Versailles, emphasizing her roles as queen, mother, and wife. Their pamphlets and memoirs painted her as the living embodiment of an honorable past, unfairly victimized by revolutionary fervor. From the courts of Prussia to the drawing rooms of England, these émigré narratives sought to galvanize support for counter-revolutionary efforts, arguing that the slaughter of a sovereign could only lead to further anarchy. Conversely, the most radical elements within France capitalized on the trial and execution to justify the removal of all perceived threats to the Republic. To the Jacobins, Marie Antoinette's death reaffirmed the necessity of eradicating every vestige of aristocratic privilege. They argued that if the Queen, once the most exalted woman in Europe, could be held accountable under the law, then no individual, regardless of birth or status, stood above the revolutionary state. This doctrine of absolute equality before the cause spurred further purges during the Terror, as revolutionaries turned against moderates, clergy, and even fellow Jacobins suspected of insufficient zeal. After the fall of Robespierre and the end of the Terror in the summer of 1794, a more nuanced appraisal of Marie Antoinette began to emerge. Historians of the Directory period and subsequent scholars noted her sporadic efforts at reform, such as her patronage of scientific expeditions, support for theatrical troupes, and advocacy for charitable institutions in Paris. They pointed out that many of her policies, while overshadowed by decadent court life, had sought to alleviate the conditions of the poor. Yet these assessments were tempered by the recognition that she had been both a participant in and a victim of a power struggle far beyond her control. In the Archives Nationales, her final letter, smuggled out in early October 1793 and later intercepted, remains a potent artifact. Addressed to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, it contains the lines, "I forgive all my enemies. I die in the hope that my death will reunite my children." Historians and archivists regard this brief missive as her ultimate testament to mercy and hope. Its preserved ink and carefully folded parchment testify to a humanity that survived even the cold confines of the Conciergerie. In modern popular culture, the story of Marie Antoinette continues to find fresh expression. Films such as Marie Antoinette, 2006, directed by Sofia Coppola, portray her life at Versailles with opulent visuals, interwoven with an undercurrent of looming tragedy. Novels ranging from historical fiction to young adult retellings reimagine her final days with introspective depth, exploring her internal struggles amid external turmoil. On stage, theatrical productions enact the Queen's last moments in candlelit settings that echo the playhouses of the 18th century, inviting audiences to witness her resignation in real time. Graphic novels and comic books offer stylized interpretations, pairing Rococo costume design with stark, modern lines to underscore the clash between past grandeur and revolutionary fervor. Among the most enduring images is that of the Queen kneeling before the guillotine, hands bound, head held aloft in dignified acceptance. This tableau, so often recreated in brushstrokes, on celluloid, and in ink, has become the defining symbol of power's fragility and personal sacrifice. It is an image that reverberates beyond the specifics of one woman's ordeal, serving as a universal reminder that the brightest crowns can fall, and that the price of political upheaval is often measured in human lives. In the soft glow of candlelight or the muted screen of a theatre, Marie Antoinette's story remains an elegy to the volatile intersection of privilege, principle, and the inexorable tide of history. Marie Antoinette's life and demise represent a pivotal shift in European perceptions of monarchy and justice. Born Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna on the 2nd of November in the year 1755, she was the 15th child and youngest daughter of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and Emperor Francis I. As Archduchess of Austria, she embodied the Habsburgs' hopes for a strengthened alliance with France. At the age of 14, on the 16th of May, 1770, she married the Dauphin Louis Auguste, later King Louis XVI, in a ceremony of unprecedented splendor at the Palace of Versailles. Her youth and foreign origins, intended to cement diplomatic ties, instead became sources of suspicion and resentment. Throughout the 1770s and early 1780s, Marie Antoinette's name became synonymous with indulgence. Portraits of her lush gowns, cascading lace ruffles, and ostentatious jewelry circulated among the nobility. The Queen's patronage of extravagant fêtes and the costly Petit Trianon estate, where she retreated from court etiquette, fed rumours of fiscal irresponsibility as France's national debt swelled to 6 billion livres by 1789. Critics dubbed her Madame Déficit, blaming her for the kingdom's economic woes, even though royal expenditures were but a fraction, approximately 5% of the state's annual budget. Tensions peaked on the night of the 20th and 21st of June, 1791, when Marie Antoinette and her family attempted to flee Paris in what became known as the Flight to Varennes. Disguised and travelling in 4 carriages, they hoped to reach loyalist forces in Montmedy. Instead, village officials recognized the royal coach at Varennes, en Argonne, and detained them. By dawn on the 22nd, the family was returned to Paris under guard. This ill-fated escape shattered whatever tenuous trust remained between the monarchy and its subjects, transforming the Queen from a lavish ornament of court life to a traitor in the eyes of many. From 1792 through 1793, Marie Antoinette endured a descent from opulence to incarceration. The 10th of August, 1792, witnessed the storming of the Tuileries Palace, where she and her family were confined in what was once their gilded home. In September of that year, they were moved to the Temple prison, a fortress in the heart of Paris. By the 2nd of August, 1793, she had been transferred to the Conciergerie, the notorious antechamber to the guillotine. There, her physical and mental health deteriorated rapidly. Medical reports preserved in the Archives Nationales describe symptoms of chronic uterine hemorrhage, extreme weight loss of approximately 22 kilograms over a matter of weeks, and profound exhaustion. Witnesses noted that by the end of September, her once powdered hair had turned a stark, unyielding white. Her trial in mid-October 1793 became a hallmark of revolutionary politicization of justice. Accusations of incest with her 10-year-old son, Dauphin Louis Charles, and conspiracy with foreign powers formed the core of the proceedings, conducted without due process and reliant on coerced testimony. The trial lasted less than 48 hours, culminating in a unanimous verdict of death by guillotine. As a symbol of absolute equality before the revolutionary state, they deemed even a queen expendable. In her final moments, aboard the wooden cart that bore her to the Place de la Révolution on the 16th of October, 1793, Marie Antoinette retained the composure befitting her former station. Clad in a plain white chemise and with her hair short-cropped and enforced custom before execution, she ascended the scaffold, with head held high. According to executioner Henri Sanson's later testimony, she stumbled upon his foot and softly said, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." At precisely 12:15 in the afternoon, the blade fell. The crowds, numbering over 10,000 along the Rue Saint-Honoré, shouted, "Vive la République!" Yet many witnesses, including journalist Mercier, recall a profound moment of silence as her body was placed into an unadorned wooden coffin. Her death did more than extinguish a monarch. It sounded a warning about the corruption of justice in the pursuit of power. The Queen, who had once been the epitome of regal splendor, became a cautionary emblem of how easily ideals of liberty and equality could be subverted by vengeance. More than 2 centuries later, Marie Antoinette's story resonates as a tragic interplay between authority, justice, and compassion. Her life from Archduchess of Austria to Queen of France, from the glittering salons of Versailles to the straw pallet of the Conciergerie, remains a sombre meditation on the perils that attend both unchecked privilege and the unbridled thirst for retribution. After the exhumation of her remains at the Madeleine Cemetery, Marie Antoinette's bones were solemnly transported to the Basilica of Saint-Denis in the spring of 1815, under the restored Bourbon monarchy of King Louis XVI II. On the 30th of March, 1815, workers had unearthed her fragile coffin from the unmarked trench where she and hundreds of other terror victims lay interred. Then, on the 2nd of April, 1815, her lead-lined casket inscribed Marie Antoinette, Reine de France, was lowered into the ancient crypt beneath Saint-Denis' soaring nave. This reburial was celebrated across Europe as a ritual of monarchical redemption, a symbolic healing of revolutionary wounds that had scarred the continent's conscience. In Paris, crowds gathered outside the basilica in a display of reverential hush. Nobles in black coats and white cravats bowed before the gilded doors, while commoners, draped in sobriety, watched through wrought-iron gates. Among them were surviving émigrés royalist exiles who had fled the terror whose tears mixed with the spring rain as they paid homage to the queen they once served. Generals of the restored army and high-ranking courtiers funded renovations of her marble sarcophagus, commissioning sculptors to carve mourning angels whose folded wings framed her name. Inscriptions etched on the monument called for pity and forgiveness, recasting her memory from Madame Deficit to the Queen of Compassion. Simultaneous with these commemorations, a wave of historical scholarship emerged across France, Austria, and England. Researchers delved into the vaults of the Archives Nationales, uncovering trial transcripts, personal letters, and royal diaries that shed new light on her life. In 1823, Madame de Genlis herself, a contemporary of the Queen, published memoirs portraying Marie Antoinette as a tender soul amid storms of power. This single phrase captured the image of a young woman overwhelmed by court intrigue and public expectation. Later in the 19th century, the Austrian-born novelist and historian Stefan Zweig contributed his own influential study, Marie Antoinette, Memoirs of a Queen, in which he underscored her resilience and latent benevolence. Zweig's narrative emphasized her modest charitable acts, her sponsorship of free medical visits for Parisian poor in 1786, and her support for scholarships to state-run schools. He argued that her attempts at mild reform had been drowned out by the din of revolutionary propaganda. Modern historians have re-examined the infamous incest allegations as a calculated smear campaign. They note that no medical examination ever verified the Dauphin's testimony, and that the statements attributed to the 10-year-old Louis Charles were taken without guardianship or independent oversight. By distorting fragments of overheard conversations and misrepresented letters, revolutionary agents had weaponized family intimacy to dismantle the last bulwark of royal authority. In doing so, they turned Marie Antoinette's private sphere into a tableau of public humiliation, forging a legacy of sympathy for the oppressed, even among those who once reviled her. During the Bourbon Restoration and throughout the 19th century, popular culture continued to feast upon the Queen's tragic story. The Comédie Française staged a series of historical plays in which Sarah Bernhardt, the era's most celebrated actress, portrayed Marie Antoinette. On opening nights, audiences wept as Bernhardt knelt before a mock scaffold, her voice quivering as she apologized to the executioner, a scene that echoed the Queen's own final words. Meanwhile, the illustrated weekly Le Monde Illustré published engravings of the Queen's journey to the guillotine, depicting her in a simple white chemise, eyes fixed forward in stoic defiance. These images circulated in rural towns and urban salons alike, embedding the Queen's last moments in the collective imagination of France. Beyond France, England and the United States embraced the Queen's story in their own literary forms. 19th-century romantic novelists recast Marie Antoinette's final letter, "I forgive all my enemies. I die in the hope that my death will reunite my children," as a testament to the redemptive power of forgiveness. Children's history books transformed her plight into moral lessons on mercy, duty, and the perils of unearned privilege. Through these varied retellings, her name achieved a universality that transcended political boundaries. She became both a cautionary legend and a figure of compassion. In recent decades, psychological analyses have identified Marie Antoinette as the archetype of the lonely queen. Despite her beauty, intellect, and rank, she was emotionally isolated by protocol and suspicion. Scholars suggest that her lack of a reliable network of supporters, once a feared and lavishly funded patron, she found herself abandoned when revolutionary fervor peaked, precluded any meaningful defense against the onslaught of accusations. Although she had endorsed charitable initiatives, such as funding a small hospital wing in Paris in 1787 and supporting artisans' guilds with royal grants, these efforts were recast as political machinations by her adversaries. Today, the Palace of Versailles preserves a poignant collection of her personal effects. Visitors can view her embroidered silk gown's delicate fabric still faintly scented with lavender, and the Sèvres tea service she commissioned for intimate gatherings. A facsimile of her letter to Madame Elizabeth is displayed under glass, its faded ink a testament to her enduring hope. Each artifact carries explanatory plaques that situate these relics within the turbulent context of late 18th century France. As guests stroll from the opulent Hall of Mirrors to the humble Petit Trianon and onto the prison cell reconstruction, they trace the arc of a life that bridged splendor and suffering. In these preserved objects, the living legacy of Marie Antoinette endures. Her journey from Archduchess to Queen, prisoner to martyr, resonates as a vivid reminder of how personal stories intertwine with broader social upheavals. Through each garment and letter, Versailles invites us to ponder the transformation of power, how it builds palaces and how it raises them, how it gilds lives and then betrays them. And perhaps, in the gentle whisper that drifts through those halls, one can almost hear the faint echo of the Queen's final plea for mercy, for forgiveness, for her children. In the museum's hushed galleries, her memory persists, urging us to balance justice with compassion and to remember that behind every crown lies a human heart. Marie Antoinette's cultural legacy extends far beyond the tragic drama of her life and death, evolving into a powerful symbol of ambition's excess and the impermanence of status. In the realm of fashion, the Marie Antoinette revival movement emerged in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, marked by designers and consumers alike embracing Rococo-inspired silhouettes. Delicate ballet skirts, tightly cinched corsets with high waists, and lavish accessories, pearls, and crystal jewelry echoed the Queen's own taste. A watershed moment occurred in the spring of 2007 when John Galliano, then creative director at Dior, unveiled his Versailles collection. Models floated down the runway under Baroque-style balconies, their gowns swirling with ornate floral embroidery and gilded trim. Critics and audiences marveled at the theatrical spectacle, which evoked the grandeur of the Palace of Versailles and reignited global interest in 18th century French aesthetics. Cinema and theatre have likewise paid homage to Marie Antoinette. In 2006, director Sofia Coppola released her film Marie Antoinette, starring Kirsten Dunst in the titular role. Coppola's interpretation juxtaposed pastel gowns and opulent interiors with a modern pop soundtrack, underscoring the Queen's emotional isolation amid overwhelming ceremony. The film's deliberate pacing and dreamy visuals captured the solemn beauty of a life lived in public glare but deprived of personal agency. Meanwhile, stage productions at the Comédie Française and other historic venues continued to dramatize her final apology to the executioner, transforming her last act into a universal moment of vulnerability and grace. In political science, Marie Antoinette's experience has become a touchstone for understanding the reputation leverage phenomenon. Modern strategists and communication experts refer to her as the prototype of the Madame Déficit smear campaign. Opponents seized upon her lavish spending, though royal court expenses comprised just 5% of France's total state budget in 1788, to stoke public outrage and frame her as the personification of systemic injustice. This tactic parallels today's viral tweet controversies, where unverified, salacious claims can destroy a public figure's credibility within hours. The lesson drawn is clear. In the digital age, as in the age of pamphlets, perception often trumps reality. From a spiritual and philosophical perspective, the Queen's final journey under the blade serves as a stark illustration of the Buddhist principle of impermanence, anitya, and the Stoic tenet that all glory and suffering are fleeting. Her swift fall from royal privilege to condemned prisoner underscores the transient nature of worldly fortune. Contemporary mindfulness instructors frequently invoke her story as a meditation on the present moment's fragility, encouraging practitioners to cherish the now before circumstances shift beyond our control. Guided retreats and podcasts on mindful history often feature her narrative to highlight how external power offers no guarantee of inner peace. Among younger generations, particularly in Europe and North America, Marie Antoinette's life resonates as an early example of female disempowerment and resilience. Married at 14 in a dynastic alliance she neither chose nor comprehended, she was thrust upon a stage of political intrigue, her opinions dismissed behind the gilded walls of Versailles. When revolutionary fervour deemed her expendable, she faced exile and execution despite her roles as queen, wife, and mother. Today's feminist discourse, including the Me Too movement, draws parallels. Women in public life still confront the eradication of their voices under patriarchal pressure. Marie Antoinette's dignified apology, "Pardon me, sir," now strikes audiences as an act of agency in a final moment over which she had any control. Through these diverse lenses, fashion, film, political communication, spirituality, and gender studies, Marie Antoinette's legacy persists. Universities offer elective courses on her historical and cultural impact. Museums from Versailles to Vienna curate exhibitions of her personal artifacts. And history podcasts produce multi-episode series, exploring her reign and downfall. Even 2 centuries after her death, her story remains a vivid case study in the fragility of power, the mechanics of reputation, and the enduring search for compassion amid turmoil. In every gown that ripples on a runway, every dramatic portrayal, and every scholarly article, the echo of Marie Antoinette endures. A timeless reminder that human lives, no matter how spectacular, are subject to change, judgment, and ultimately, memory. In the field of education, the story of Marie Antoinette has become a compelling subject in both secondary schools and universities, particularly within courses on the French Revolution and European culture of the 18th and 19th centuries. Modern curricula no longer confine themselves to recounting political events. They embrace multidisciplinary analysis. In modules on economics, students debate the financial crisis that beset France in the late 18th century, examining how national debt soared to almost 6 billion livres by 1789. Social studies components invite learners to assess class structures and the widening gulf between the aristocracy and the peasantry, while cultural studies sessions explore the Rococo style's ornate aesthetics and its symbolic function as an emblem of royal excess. At leading institutions such as the Sorbonne in Paris and King's College London, Marie Antoinette features in case study assignments. Learners are tasked with dissecting the Madame Deficit smear campaign, evaluating how pamphleteers manipulated court expenditures, though these comprised roughly 5% of the state's annual budget to inflame public sentiment. Students then draw parallels to contemporary crises in media management, extracting lessons learned that communications strategists today regard as classics in crisis control. Through these exercises, emerging historians and public relations professionals alike appreciate the enduring relevance of 18th century events to 21st century challenges. Language departments also leverage the Queen's legacy to enrich students' linguistic and literary competencies. In French literature course, André Chénier's poem La Jeune Captive is a staple reading. This elegiac verse, structured in the traditional look-bat meter, employs the Queen's impending doom as a catalyst for broader reflections on liberty and fate. Assignments often require students to translate selected stanzas into English, then discuss the tension between poetic beauty and the grim historical reality it portrays. Similarly, English language classes exploring translation theory present comparative analyses, challenging pupils to retain the poem's rhythmic qualities and emotional depth while ensuring semantic accuracy. Social media platforms have revived Marie Antoinette's narrative for digital native audiences. On TikTok and Instagram, history influencers produce micro-documentaries spanning 60 seconds or less, reconstructing scenes from the palace's glittering halls and the Queen's final ride on the open cart. Hashtags such as #Marie Antoinette Challenge encourage users to don period costumes and record their own monologues as the Queen, some reciting her last letter's closing plea, "I forgive all my enemies. I die in the hope that my death will reunite my children." These interactive campaigns generate millions of views, blending entertainment with education and illustrating how history can be both consumed and co-created on personal devices. From a spiritual and philosophical standpoint, several mindfulness and meditation groups in France and North America have organized workshops titled From Splendor to Shadows. Facilitators guide participants through reflective practices grounded in Marie Antoinette's trajectory, from opulence to captivity. By recounting her abrupt fall from gilded carriages to straw pallets, they invite attendees to confront life's impermanence, a tenet central to both Buddhist anicca, impermanence, and Stoic philosophy. Exercises include silent contemplation on historical artifacts, a powdered wig fragment, or a replica of her chemise to cultivate detachment from worldly attachments. These sessions aim to empower individuals to release anxieties about the past and embrace present-moment awareness. Lastly, cultural tourism has embraced the Queen's legacy through guided itineraries known as the Marie Antoinette Trail in both Paris and Vienna. In Paris, tours commence at the Conciergerie, where visitors peer into the cell once inhabited by the condemned Queen. Guides describe her daily routine within those damp stone walls, then lead groups along the Rue de la Conciergerie to Place de la Concorde, where the scaffold once stood. From there, participants travel to the Basilica of Saint-Denis, entering the royal crypt to view her marble sarcophagus alongside those of her ancestors. In Vienna, the journey begins at the Hofburg Palace, her birthplace, where docents illuminate the political significance of her Habsburg lineage. Visitors view the grand imperial apartments, imagining the young Archduchess preparing for her marriage to the French Dauphin. The tour then crosses to Paris either in person or via virtual reality installations linking the two capitals in a single narrative. Throughout, guides decode interiors, garments, and court rituals, providing context for each location's role in her life. By tracing her path from Austria to France, from Versailles to the Temple Prison, tourists gain a visceral sense of how power, privilege, and vulnerability intersected in her story. Together, these educational, digital, spiritual, and touristic approaches ensure that Marie Antoinette's legacy remains vivid and instructive. Whether dissected in a university seminar, recreated on a smartphone screen, contemplated in a meditation circle, or walked through on cobblestone streets, her life continues to resonate as a multifaceted case study. In every classroom, workshop, or guided tour, the Queen's experiences invite us to reflect on the delicate balance between authority and empathy, history and memory, spectacle and substance, and remind us that, even centuries later, the past informs our present in both subtle and profound ways. The death of Marie Antoinette has echoed through history as the ultimate royal tragedy. Yet its significance extends far beyond the fall of a single monarch. On a broader social level, her demise became a cautionary tale of what occurs when power goes unchecked and prestige is wielded as a weapon to exploit the populace. She represented the final embodiment of absolute feudal authority, and her downfall signaled the close of the era in which kings ruled by divine right. In the ash of her legacy, the principle of citizen equality emerged, laying the philosophical foundation for the idea of république. Politically, Marie Antoinette's life and end are still invoked in modern speeches on reform and the need to curb state authority. Contemporary leaders often reference the boundless extravagance of Marie Antoinette when discussing today's financial scandals, warning that social unrest can follow when the elite drift too far from the realities of everyday life. The Madame Deficit episode has been integrated into public administration and leadership training curricula, illustrating the vital importance of transparency, accountability, and genuine engagement with constituents. Trains examine how the Queen's penchant for splendour, a trait that accounted for only about 5% of royal spending by 1789, was magnified by pamphleteers into proof of a regime indifferent to public suffering. In economics, the collapse of France's fiscal health at the close of the 18th century is inseparable from her name. Discussion of the near 6 billion livres national debt by 1789 routinely leads to case studies on Marie Antoinette's supposed role in deepening the crisis. Modern seminars on sovereign debt crises draw direct comparisons, highlighting how unfair taxation policies and lavish royal expenditures can precipitate systemic collapse. Scholars scrutinize late 18th century France alongside 21st century debt defaults in Europe and the United States, extracting lessons on restructuring national finances to avoid repeating the mistakes that once ensnared a kingdom. Beyond academic and political spheres, Marie Antoinette's story persists in folk culture. Traditional ballads, street songs, and local legends keep alive the memory of her final apology before the blade. "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." In some outskirts of Paris, older residents still tell of the white silhouette that they claim glides through the Temple Prison's corridors on the eve of her execution, a whispered reminder that the spiritual resonance of compassion can transcend the brutality of violence. Each year on the 16th of October, The anniversary of her death, historical enthusiasts gather at the Place de la Concorde, the very site of the former guillotine, for a candlelight vigil. Around 200 participants light simple white candles, each flame symbolizing a promise to uphold mercy and justice in opposition to the terror's cruelty. A modest wooden altar bears a banner inscribed with "Je vous pardonne tout," I forgive all my enemies, evoking Marie Antoinette's final letter in which she wrote, "I forgive all my enemies. I die in the hope that my death will reunite my children." The event is quiet, almost meditative, as voices merge into a soft murmur beneath the autumn sky. Over 2 centuries, her narrative has been recast many times through opera, theatre, literature, and scholarship, yet its core message endures: the interplay of power and vulnerability, and the enduring potency of human compassion. From queen enthroned at Versailles to prisoner bound upon an open cart, Marie Antoinette's transformation serves as a timeless reminder that unchecked authority can devour its own symbols, and that true strength may lie in the capacity to forgive. In the gentle glow of each candlelight vigil, and in every stirring recounting of her final words, her legacy continues to offer profound lessons about the fragility of power and the redemptive power of mercy.